Hello and welcome back. This is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Architect video. This time it's been quite a few weeks since I've last done a video, and I kind of want to quickly explain why. So most of the time I've been pretty much optimizing my game. Mostly that's all I've been doing. I've made a few changes to the islands and the essentially the campaign levels. But for the most part, it's been mostly optimizing, so I'm only going to cover the stuff that I've done with optimizing briefly, and then I'm going to move on to the dungeon aspect stuff, which I've changed, so a lot of the dungeon level, a lot of dungeon related stuff in this video. So yeah, there's been quite a few weeks since I've had a break. The main reason for that is unfortunately I made a very big mistake. I'm actually going to do a video after I've worked on this game, kind of going over some of the mistakes I've made during the last few years of development, since I left university. And I made a huge mistake during this development, which is to do with trying to optimize the game, and it basically broke a lot of stuff. So I ended up having to fix that for essentially a week to 2 weeks. It's actually been a bit longer since I last recorded, about 3 weeks, coming up to the 4th week, and that's because essentially for a week to 2 weeks I had to fix everything. What you're seeing in the background is some gameplay of me playing the tutorial. It might look a little bit different than it used to, and that's because there's been a lot of visual changes and things, but again, not going to go over them right now. So the first thing is that all of our NPCs had rigid bodies on them, and it kept rigid bodies on there so that they could detect other collisions and colliders and things that they needed to. Without the rigid body, it just wouldn't be able to detect them. However, that was very unnecessary with the NPCs. They didn't need their rigid body. They didn't need rigid bodies, unfortunately, because all that was doing was just taking more physics, and it was really unnecessary. They don't actually collide with anything. It's all when they get up to a specific building, the distance is what determines if an action should take place, and so there was no collisions really happening. The only collisions that they really have are with monsters, but what I've done is since there's only a couple of monsters that actually spawn from dungeons, what I've done is just added rigid bodies onto them for them to detect those collisions. This meant that I could remove the capsule collisions on them because I don't want them interacting with anything else either. We were also able to simplify this nav mesh, make it a little bit more optimized, a bit more accurate. We also removed the auto traverse off mesh because we actually teleport them, we warp them onto the mesh whenever they get stuck anyway. And we also removed the auto repath because once they get to a target, they don't really need to repath every time. Once they get to a target, they get a new target anyway. Another thing that we've done is we've removed all of the unnecessary colliders and rigid bodies on buildings as well. So you can see we got our shelter here. Looks a little bit different. You can see that we got our shelter here and we got our basic scripts there still the same. However, we've removed the rigid body, the collider, for the exact same reason as the NPCs. They just weren't necessary. They were requiring more physics, and yeah, we could just get rid of them, increasing the frame rate. Now, talking about the frame rate, I also want to quickly mention that the frame rate was incredibly poor before we optimized the game. Another reason this took so long is because we were essentially getting on the higher levels, so what I call the freedom levels, which is basically like a sandbox where you can build whatever you want. There's no objective apart from getting to 5 stars. Essentially that level was incredibly poor at running because it was so big. The levels are so big and they have so many items in them, so many colliders, so many rigid bodies, and eventually you would have so many guests in them. Once you get to 5 stars, the game would just run so poorly. You would end up dropping down to 2 frames a second, which is incredibly bad. You know, the game standard is 60 frames. If anything lower than that, really, you have to get it to that 60 frames. You shouldn't really have a game release that's, you know, working at 30 frames anymore. That's pretty low, or anything like 40 frames doesn't really work. Anything lower than 30 frames is considered unreleasable, and 60 frames is the absolute standard. So I had to get the game to 60, but it was running at, so essentially when I ran it at normal speed, it was at 4 frames. When I sped the game up, it would drop down to 2 or 1 frame, which is actually still 4 frames. Technically, because when you speed the game's time up, it actually lowers the frame rate, but to keep it smooth at the same. But basically that was still just unusable, so it was so choppy, and when NPCs spawned, they would just you'd get a huge lag spike. This was completely unacceptable. Anyway, going back to what I was talking about, so with all the buildings done and with the NPCs sorted, in terms of the actual prefabs, there wasn't much more I could do on the prefabs once I'd worked all that out. You can also see, coming back to my screen, you can also see that I've got a underscore OP, so that's the optimized performance of all these prefabs, just to keep track of which ones have been optimized, and all of these have, including their scripts, so their deconstruction script, any unnecessary code has been removed, and some of it has been optimized. Same with the building stats, a lot of typed out code and commented code has been removed, unnecessary values that weren't being used have been removed, so that's just going to optimize everything a little bit more. We've also got lighting changes throughout the level. You can't really see them they're not too big of an impact when you first see them compared to before, but there's a lot of changes that I've done to the quality of the game. If I quickly show this on our screen, right here are our settings. What I've done is I've actually gone into graphics and changed a bunch of things around. We've also got quality, which you only see low, medium and high now. And I've made a bunch of customized changes to our lighting in general. All of our things have changed. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because that's really something that you tweak and change yourself to make it more optimized. It's a little bit tedious to talk about, but essentially I had to tweak every individual aspect, as well as on the universal render pipeline, on these stats as well right here. So I had to change these manually to fix them into a place where I really like it, but it isn't too much on the performance. And another thing to notice right here is that the NPC's animation has been disabled. The reason for this is their walking animations, because honestly you rarely zoom into the NPCs. It's rarely something that you'll notice that much of them walking. It's very subtle when they walk, and frankly it doesn't really make any difference to anything. Because the player will very rarely zoom in and look at the NPCs, and because it's a downward facing game, so it's really a little bit top down, it's not really that relevant and it's not really noticeable that much. So I removed the animations, which increases our performance a little bit more as well. Very subtler, but it's still an extra frame or something like that, especially later on when we have hundreds of guests. The next thing is that if we come into our save system right here in the script, I've decided to add a pooler. Now an object pooler is essentially when you get a group of objects, you spawn them into the world before the game started, and then you take from that pool objects and then use them and reuse them, add them back into the pool, take them back out, rather than destroying an object and respawning it, which requires a lot more cache, a lot more it creates a lot more garbage in your game, and allocated data is got to be used. It's essentially a lot more performance, and it requires a lot more of the game's memory. It's the worst thing to do is to just when you've got a huge game like this, to destroy objects and then respawn them in. Eventually your game just starts to dive in performance, and I was getting some huge dive in later on as I played this for maybe an hour. The dive was just huge. So what I did is I've added some pooling, which has completely eliminated most of the frame rate issues. So when we spawn in an NPC, it would create a massive lag spike and it would slow the game down. You know, if I were getting 30 frames before that, it would drop down to 1 frame, 2 frames. It was incredibly poor. And essentially what I've done is I've pooled them, so you're not really spawning anything in, so there's no need for those spikes. Everything's there, and if you're running at 60 frames already, then your amount isn't going to change when you spawn in. You know, it's not going to affect any of the frame rate. So essentially what we've got here is all of our different NPCs. We've got a maximum which is going to spawn in the very beginning, which is 50. Now I highly recommend looking up pooling, because I was very new to pooling for spawn pools. It's not something I do very often because I never make games like this, which take months to make. So I don't often make games like this that require this kind of system. Because it's increased the frame rate so much, I'm going to use this in future projects, absolutely, and I highly recommend you do as well. There's loads of videos on it. I actually checked out a ton of different videos just to try and get an idea of how this works, and it's actually pretty simple. As I mentioned, it's literally spawning everything in and then just activating and deactivating them when you need them. Also, I'm doing the same thing for inside the dungeon with the monsters, because we get huge lag spikes when the monsters first spawn in, and so this is really helping with that as well for performance inside the dungeon, which was the only real performance issue in dungeons, was just the initial spawning of monsters, which completely is smooth now. The next big performance boost for the game, which was a huge problem before, was right down here, if I can quickly find it. Right here we have our object count, and this script right here is completely different. Before, what we were doing was using an array, collecting a bunch of objects by finding them by their tags, collecting those objects into an array, and then we were reading what the length was to get a number, or taking objects from those arrays, but we were having to do it constantly because the game would constantly change. You would have different amounts of objects all the time, different amounts of paths or guests or different kind of food buildings, and so the game would constantly have to find those objects by tag. When you have a huge game like this one, unfortunately it just takes ages to find, and your frame rate drops like crazy every time it needs to run it, because we need to find the objects constantly to keep our counts of objects accurate. It basically ran the game into the ground with the frame rate. This was the biggest issue, and so the easiest thing to do was to create an array list. Now, reason I had it initially like that is because when it's a small game, it doesn't matter that much. Your frame rate's usually quite high, and way above the 60 mark. If you're just finding objects constantly and it's only a small game, it's not going to really be an issue. However, when you become a game like this, where it's huge and it has like thousands upon thousands of lines of code to run, and it's got so many objects in the level, then you're going to have to use an array list to keep track of everything. Now, the easiest thing to do is every time we spawn an object in, which we couldn't use spawn pools for our buildings, it would take too long to set up because we have so many different buildings. So what I've done is I've left it so that it still is instantiating, and the frame rate's still fine, so I think it's okay. If the frame rate was lower than 60 on the hardest levels and it dropped below them, I was going to change all the buildings to be pooled as well from a spawn pool, but it didn't need to do that. So essentially what we got right here is all of our different objects. Now you can see that they're all 0, that's because the level hasn't started yet, but essentially at the very start we find all of our objects. Now we do have right here our paths, and that's because paths are already still in the level. They're not being added manually, and essentially when we spawn in an object, it gets added to our array list for one of these. So if we add in a dungeon, it gets added to this array list, and then we can use that array list to get our references. Rather than having to find objects, we just get our objects from these array lists. When we destroy a building, we remove it from the array list. It's as simple as that. It works very well, it's efficient, it doesn't require that much effort, and it's essentially only one line of code, which is to add or to remove when the game is running, and you only do that when you need to do it. So the only time I'll ever remove or add it is obviously when I manually destroy an object or try and spawn one in. So it's only going to run that one line of code literally whenever I ask it to. So it's incredibly efficient as opposed to before, which was every second or 2 seconds or whatever I would have to find a tag, and it would have to cycle through all the objects in the level just to find that object, and then it would get a reference, and then it would have to do it all over again immediately. So that was really poor, and now that's fixed, and now we have a much smoother game, as you can see now. Very smooth, no real issues, no drop in frame rate. I've also, at the top of here, you can see that I've got a custom frame rate counter. When it drops to 30 or 20 when I speed up the game, again, I mentioned it before, but it's not actually changing the speed of the frame rate. It's not actually dropping. It's just that the time scale of the game is sped up, so it's having to use less frames, but it's actually still 60 frames. It's still smooth. If you drop it back to normal speed, it goes back to 60. That's why I say at base, which is at the base speed is 60. So if it as long as it flatlines at a higher speed of 20 frames, that means that it's still not dropping low. Of course, all I have to do is change it back to its normal speed to see if it's still 60 when I'm running at a difficult situation. Now this is already becoming quite a long video, but there was so much to discuss, so we're going to now move on to the dungeon aspect of stuff. So to move on to the dungeon related items, let's start off with our dungeon level. There's still bugs and there's still issues, of course. I've only just now moved on from optimizing, which I'm happy with optimizing now, and the scripts are mostly cleaned up. I went through a lot of scripts, as you can see right here. We've got so many scripts in here right now. We've got so many systems in place, so many scripts that are managing everything, so many crafting scripts and character scripts, attribute scripts. So there was a lot for me to do and optimize. So now what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our dungeon. And immediately what you're going to see is that everything looks a little bit different. It looks the same, but it also looks different. So we can see the UI on our right is not really that different, but on our left it's very different. So we no longer have what we had before, which is essentially on the left we have our weapon. We can cycle through what we have, and it's a little bit cleaner, I think so. Anyway, and you can also see the name of the weapon, which is quite nice. And what you can see is everything based on the stamina, how you attack. So it wasn't necessary to have any kind of extra stuff on any bars. What you're also going to notice is that the level is a lot smoother to run around. The navigation is a lot smoother, and there's not really any issues with the monster chasing us. In most cases, they will also find other routes to try and get to you as best they can if you're in range. You can also go up stairs a lot easier on certain levels that have them, and essentially in general it's just a lot better. Just the movement is way better. You can see how smooth the actual nav mesh is. So as you can see, it's much more rounded, it has a little bit more of an edge to keep the monsters away from getting stuck on them. We also have, it's just incredibly smooth and simple as opposed to breaking up everywhere. And this has meant the performance is a little bit better as well for the nav mesh, but it just looks way smoother and better and easier to navigate. We removed quite a lot of extra scripts and extra prefabs that weren't necessary, and if we go into here right now, a lot of it is smoothed out. So we've removed unnecessary blocks that are in here and smoothed everything to different regions. We've expanded some regions, made some regions smaller, and just in general it just looks a lot better. We've done the same thing for the lush area, so we've added a bunch more a little bit different areas to our lush. We've kept it simple so that the player doesn't get distracted, but we've also added some extra parts to it. So if we just remove the light in there, and this just makes the fighting a lot easier. The ground is less distracting, and it's just I just think it runs better. The monsters again have had a massive change to their scripts. I've optimized a bunch of stuff, I tried to change a bunch of collisions, and some of their attacks have changed, as well as their timing. A ton of changes to their animation aspects, so because they weren't working before, and in general their chasing, their movement, and how close they get as well. So another thing is that when a monster got too close, they would try and push you all over the place, you'd get stuck. Now they won't push you if they're right next to you. They'll only push you if there's multiple of them pushing other objects, so then they'll push you because it's more force. But if it's only one or two of them pushing against you, you won't actually get pushed around, they'll just stop. Previously what we'd have is a specialized dungeon where you might only get islands in the volcanic. It just looked a little bit boring to not have it randomized. It looked too standard and too obvious, like having everything with just spires, especially on the big levels, made the areas incredibly boring to navigate and play in. So now it's all randomized. I've removed sort of that code that randomizes through that ends up randomizing their specific dungeon type, and now we just have all of them sort of playing into that type of theme. So we'll get like maybe we'll get a couple of spires and islands, or maybe one or two hill specific ones like in the lush. the dungeon we might get a couple of trap ones mixed in with the void ones, or you know, things like that. The only ones that haven't really changed is the dungeon, because they work okay, but I want to add in a couple more things and make some of these dungeons have more random spawning objects in that aren't interactable by the player. Just add a little bit more to it. Things like maybe a spot of grass, or maybe a mushroom spawning, just small things like a barrel or something like that, just to add a little bit of detail to these dungeons. The control script also for the dungeon has changed dramatically. It's a very different thing altogether. So right here we got our dungeon script, which has changed quite a lot. We've also got the counts of how many monsters spawn, all different types of monsters, and their count to make sure we don't overlap the amount, because once it hits the amount on a pool, which we've got right here, our spawn pool, we've got all of our different monsters right here. Once it hits the maximum amount, which right now is 4, what will happen, which I'm going to change, what will happen is it'll end up reusing objects that are still active. So if once it hits that 4th count, to get a 5th that will spawn when it's called, it will take away from the 1st in the pool and reuse that one instead. And that's something we don't want, so that's what this count is for. It's to stop them from, once we hit a maximum amount, it'll stop them from using the extra ones and reusing active monsters. So anyway, we've also got our monster spawning right here, which has changed a little bit, and we have instead this monster spawning monster was actually on every single region and up to 3 spawners. That means that all of this script was activating all the time on every region. We were talking on the larger regions, you know, we were talking 16 spawners sometimes, and so that was all running the same script over and over when it didn't need to. Now we only have one script controlling the spawn of monsters, which means they don't spawn at the same time either, which is before they were all spawning roughly at the same time, creating huge lag spikes. We won't get that with the pool, but now it's even better with just one script calling that. And of course we have our frame rate counter that I'm using, which will be disabled when the game gets fully released. We also have, when we hit a monster, we have an effect come up, which is like a hit effect, and this is just a little bit extra because you can't see their health normally. If you hit them, the standard hit color is actually white. That's when they have over 80% health. As you get lower in their percentage of health, the hit color changes, and once it's really red, it means that the next time you hit it, it'll kill it. And when they die, they also have a new effect, which is a bunch of skulls like exploding outwards, which I think looks cooler than the purple smoke that you'd see, the magic purple skull. Okay, so for now that is everything. That's a lot of information. This has been a very long video. I'm hopefully going to be able to cut it down to be pretty short. But in terms of how much we got left, it's not very much. The optimization for the levels is done. The levels are actually finished. All the objectives are done. So it's literally just the dungeon, making the dungeons look better, adding a couple more regions, and making sure all of the attacks and weapons are working inside the dungeon. After that, it's ready for release. Now, to talk about release for a second, we're essentially going to have it. I'm not going to charge anything for it because, again, I don't think it's even though there's so much work that's gone into it, in reality, competing with other games is so difficult that if I were to charge any money for it, it would probably not get many sales, and I would rather more people play it, especially after working so hard on it. For me, it's not about necessarily the money as people playing it. I would rather more people play it and have fun and talk about it and sort of demonstrate my ability to make these games. I need more people to see them so that they can actually see my credibility in creating games, and that's kind of what these games are. They're all about like proving my skill, and I just enjoy making them anyway. So yeah, I'll probably put it on the I'm gonna hopefully try and get it on console again, like Turtle Trial, and have it probably for free, and I'm gonna be doing the same on itch.io and things like that. I'm probably going to release these games for free. Yeah, but not long now. Once I've done with this game, I'm essentially going to be creating as many games as possible, like small games, doing a bunch of game jams, because I haven't done a game jam in a long time. I did try one a couple months ago, but it didn't work out, and I have tried to make a couple of other games while I've been making this, but there was just so much for this game to do, and I've been through so many iterations that it kind of took all my time, and I want to get into making lots of little games like I did last year. Yeah, unfortunately this was a really long video, but hopefully it's not been too bad. This has been ProTaleDev, and next time what we'll be doing is we'll be hopefully showing off the game and running a couple of levels. Yeah, getting it into a finished state. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.